Abigail Turner pressed the barrel of her grandfather's rifle against the cabin door and told herself she wouldn't open it. Not for anything. Not for anyone. She had done that before. Trusted a voice in the dark, believed kindness was real, and it had cost her everything she'd ever had. The wind outside was screaming. Something heavy hit the porch. Then she heard it. Small. Terrified. A child's voice cutting straight through the storm, through the wood, through every wall she'd ever built around herself. Please, my daddy can't wake up. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single chapter. Drop the name of your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The rifle was still in her hands when Abigail opened the door. She didn't lower it right away. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. You didn't open your door in the middle of a Montana blizzard and just stand there with your arms at your sides like some fool who'd never had the world knock her flat. You opened it ready. You always opened it ready. What she saw stopped her cold. A horse black as coal, legs folded wrong beneath it, lay collapsed against the porch railing. Beside it, half buried in snow, was a man. Big. Dark-coated. One hand still tangled in the reins like he'd been trying to hold on until the very last second, and his body had just refused. And standing over him in a coat 2 sizes too big, her tiny boot soaked clean through, was a little girl no older than 6. She had dark hair plastered to her face and her eyes. Lord, those eyes were enormous, fixed straight on Abigail, like she was either the answer to a prayer or the last thing she'd ever see. Please, the girl said again. Her voice didn't shake. It was too scared to shake. He fell off. He couldn't hold on anymore, and he fell, and I couldn't wake him up. I tried a lot of times. Abigail stood in the doorway for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds where she thought about what she'd promised herself. About doors and trust, and every single time she'd reached out her hand and had it slapped away or laughed at or used. 3 seconds of every voice she'd ever heard telling her that a woman like her had no business caring about anyone because caring only made you a target. Then she stepped out onto the porch in her bare feet, and the snow bit straight through her socks, and she didn't care even a little. Get inside, she told the girl. Right now. Go. But my daddy. I'll get your daddy. You go inside, you stand by the stove, you don't touch anything. Go. The girl went. Abigail crouched down beside the man and grabbed his collar and pulled, and he was heavy, genuinely seriously heavy, in the way that men who worked hard their whole lives got heavy, not soft, but dense, like something built to last, and she hauled him up onto his feet, the way she'd hauled feed bags and injured calves and everything else the world had ever needed hauling. She got one arm around her shoulders and dragged him through the door. She didn't ask herself why. She already knew why. Because she'd heard that little girl's voice, and something in her that she'd thought was dead had woken straight up, and there wasn't a thing on this earth she could have done about it. She got him onto the cot near the stove and stepped back and looked at him properly for the first time. He was younger than she'd expected. Maybe 40, maybe a hard 38. Dark stubble. Dark hair soaked through with melt. His coat was expensive. She could tell that even wet and torn, and beneath it, his right leg was wrapped in a bandage that had soaked through dark and ugly. She could smell infection from where she stood. That's bad, she said to no one in particular. Is he going to die? The girl asked from directly behind her. Abigail turned. The girl was exactly where she'd told her not to be, right beside her, staring down at the man with an expression that was trying very hard to be brave and mostly failing. I told you to stand by the stove. I did. For a minute. The girl looked up at her. Is he going to die? You can tell me. I'm not a baby. Abigail looked at her for a moment. Then she looked back at the man on the cot. Not if I can help it, she said. What's your name? Rosie. Rosie what? Rosie Calloway. My daddy's Ethan Calloway. We're from Texas. She said it the way a child says something they've been coached to say in emergencies, quick and precise. He owns the Calloway Ranch. It's very big. He said if anything happened, I was supposed to tell people that. Abigail filed that information away and went to her shelf for what she needed. How long has he been riding with that leg like that? Rosie thought about it. Since yesterday morning, maybe the morning before. He kept saying it was fine. Men always say it's fine. Abigail pulled her kit down and looked at the girl. Sit down, Rosie Calloway from Texas. This is going to take a while, and don't watch if you're the kind to go faint. I don't faint, Rosie said, and sat down. She didn't faint. She watched the whole thing with those enormous dark eyes, quiet as a held breath, while Abigail cleaned the wound and redressed it with steady hands and a focused mind, and none of the panic she could feel sitting just below the surface of her composure. She'd dealt with infection before. On ranch animals, on herself once after a wire fence got her arm good. She knew what it looked like when it was winning and what it looked like when you still had a chance. This was a chance. Not a comfortable one, but a chance. When she was done, she stood up and pressed the back of her hand to his forehead, and it was hot. Too hot. She went and got a cloth and cold water and laid it across his brow and pulled the blanket up and did all the things her mother had taught her a long time ago in a house that no longer existed, with a voice she still heard sometimes when things got very quiet. He's going to sleep for a while, she said. That's what he needs. Rosie nodded. She hadn't moved from the chair. You're very good at that. Abigail didn't say anything. Do you have children? Rosie asked. No. Why not? Rosie. Abigail looked at her. You want something warm to eat. That redirected her the way it redirected most people. Questions about food cut through almost anything. Abigail put a pot on and heated what she had: beans, mostly some salt pork cornbread she'd made that afternoon, because baking was the thing she did when her thoughts got too loud, and she set a bowl in front of the girl and watched her eat with the focused intensity of a child who hadn't had a proper meal in too long. When did you two eat last? Breakfast yesterday, Rosie said around a mouthful. We were going to stop in Harlan, but the storm came early, and Daddy said we had to keep moving. She swallowed. He said he knew where he was going. He usually does. Where were you going? Rosie hesitated. It was a careful hesitation, too careful for a 6-year-old, which told Abigail it was coached. Just riding, she said. Abigail let it go, for now. She ate her own bowl, standing at the counter, the way she always ate, facing the door out of habit. The storm had gotten worse in the past hour. She could hear it pressing against the walls of the cabin like it had a personal grudge, and through the one small window, the world was nothing but white and dark. They weren't going anywhere. Not tonight. Not tomorrow, most likely. She looked at the man on the cot. He was breathing, which was something. His color was still bad, but not getting worse. She'd seen worse. She'd brought worse back from the edge, four-legged and otherwise. She thought about the horse on her porch and made herself go check on it, pulling her coat on and stepping back out into the cold. It had gotten itself up. That was a good sign, and she led it to the small shelter she kept for her own horse, got it under cover and out of the wind, and checked its legs. Nothing broken. Just exhausted and cold, like its rider. When she came back inside, Rosie was asleep in the chair. Abigail stood and looked at her for a moment. This small person who had stood in a blizzard over her unconscious father and talked to a stranger with a rifle, and not once dissolved into the kind of crying that would have been completely forgivable. This child had backbone. Abigail recognized it because she'd had to grow her own backbone in hard soil too, and she knew what it looked like. She carried Rosie to the cot against the far wall. She had, too, a habit she'd kept from the years when her sister had visited before her sister had married and moved south, and visits became letters, and letters became nothing, and covered her with the good quilt and went back to sit by the stove. She did not sleep. She sat in her chair and watched the man across the room and thought about the last time she'd let a person stay in her cabin. Thought about Roger Haynes, who had come to her with smooth words and a warm smile and a story about needing someone, and she had believed every single word of it, because she'd been 26 and still foolish enough to think that want was the same as worth. He had taken what he wanted and told the town a story that had followed her for 12 years. A story about a woman who'd thrown herself at a man who hadn't wanted her, a story that got told at the general store, and the church steps, and every table in every eating establishment in Harlan, Montana, until it became the thing everyone knew about her. The same way they knew the name of the mountain and the direction of the river. Abigail Turner. Poor thing. Did you hear about what happened? She'd stopped going into town after a while. It was easier. She had the ranch work, she cooked and cleaned and managed the stable for the McGrady family, who were kind enough in a distant way, in the way that employers were kind when they valued your work, but not particularly you. And she had her cabin and her books and the company of the horses, and she had told herself very firmly for a very long time that this was enough. That wanting more was what got a woman like her hurt. She told herself that again now, sitting in the chair while the storm shook the world outside. Then the man on the cot said, "Where's Rosie?" His voice was rougher than she'd expected. Lower. Like something that came from the ground up. Abigail turned her head. His eyes were open, dark, slightly glazed with fever, but open and tracking. He was looking at the ceiling, and then at her, and then around the room with the particular focus of someone who understands they are in a strange place and is working out fast whether that's a problem. "She's sleeping," Abigail said. "In the other cot. Over there." He turned his head and found his daughter in the dark, and something in the tension of his whole body changed. Dropped. Like a knot someone had cut loose. "You took her in," he said. "I took you both in." "I don't remember." He tried to sit up and made a sound that wasn't quite a groan, and Abigail pointed at him. "Don't." He stopped. "Your leg is infected," she said. "I've cleaned it and dressed it, and if you try to move around on it tonight, you'll undo everything I've done and be in considerably worse shape by morning. So don't." He looked at her for a moment. "You a doctor?" "No." "Nurse?" "No." "Then how do you—" "Because I've been working a ranch since I was 12 years old, and I've seen every kind of injury there is," she said. "And because my mother knew medicine and she taught me. And because it's not complicated if you pay attention." She paused. "Are you going to keep asking me questions, or are you going to rest like I told you?" He was quiet for a moment. Then slowly, he almost smiled. It didn't quite get there. She could see the fever and the pain pulling against it, but it tried. "Ethan Calloway," he said. "I know. Your daughter told me." "Rosie talks." "She does." "I'm sorry for the intrusion, Miss Turner. Abigail Turner." She stood and went to check the cloth on his forehead. Still cool enough. She replaced it. "And don't be sorry. Just rest." He was quiet for a little while. She thought he'd gone under again. Then he said, "Those men who were following us. Have you seen—" "No one's been by." She looked down at him. "What men?" "Doesn't matter. You said men were following you." "I said doesn't matter right now." She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze steadily, even through the fever, and she could see he was a man accustomed to deciding what got said and when. She recognized that too. She'd spent years learning to do the same thing herself. "All right," she said. "We'll leave it." "Miss Turner." His voice was quieter now, the effort of talking catching up to him. "I'm in your debt." "You don't owe me anything." "That's not—" "Rest," she said. "We can talk about debts when you've got a fever that isn't trying to kill you. Go to sleep, Mr. Calloway." He went to sleep. She sat back down in her chair. Outside, the storm kept pushing at the walls, and she listened to it, and listened to the sound of two people breathing in her cabin. A sound she had not heard in so many years that she'd almost forgotten. It had a weight to it, a presence, a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove, and she told herself it didn't mean anything. It was just the storm. It was just the circumstances. In 2 days the snow would lift, and they would go, and things would be exactly as they had been, which was fine. Which was exactly right. Which was all she'd asked for. She believed every word of that right up until the morning. She was at the stove when Rosie woke up, and the girl lay still for just a moment, disoriented, looking around at the unfamiliar ceiling, with the particular wide-eyed wariness of a child who had learned that waking up in new places was not always safe. Then she found Abigail, and something in her settled. "Good morning," Rosie said. "Morning." Abigail set a cup of warm milk near the cot. "How'd you sleep?" "Good. The blanket smells like lavender." Rosie sat up and wrapped her arms around her knees. "My mama used to have lavender. She put it in all the closets." She said it the way children said things about their mothers, sometimes directly matter-of-factly, with a bruise underneath the facts that they hadn't quite learned yet to keep private. Abigail kept her voice even. "Your daddy told me about her. Daddy doesn't talk about her much." Rosie looked toward the other cot. "Is he better?" "Some. He needs another day or two." "He won't like that." Rosie said it with the resigned authority of someone who had been managing this particular man's impatience for her entire life. "He always thinks he's fine when he's not." "So you mentioned. Did he argue with you last night?" "He tried." Rosie nodded like this was completely expected. "He argues with doctors, too. He argued with Dr. Ferris so much that Dr. Ferris stopped coming to the ranch." She paused. "Are you married?" "Rosie, I'm just asking. I know what you're doing and you can stop." Abigail set down her spoon and looked at the girl. Rosie looked back at her with an expression of complete innocence that was entirely unconvincing. "Drink your milk." Rosie drank her milk. Ethan woke up an hour later with his fever dropped enough that he could sit up without looking like the effort might finish him, and he looked around the cabin with the slower, more deliberate attention of a man taking real stock of a place, rather than just confirming his child was alive. His eyes moved over the shelves of books, the careful organization of tools and supplies, the small, precise neatness of a place that had been lived in alone and arranged to suit one person's specific habits. He looked at all of it the way men looked at things they hadn't expected and were recalibrating around. "You live here alone," he said. "Yes." "How long?" "Long enough." She set a bowl beside him. "Eat." He looked at the bowl. He looked at her. "You give orders like someone who expects them followed, and you follow them like someone who isn't used to taking them." She sat down across from him. "But you're going to Mr. Calloway because you're in my house, and your leg is still in questionable condition, and your daughter is right there watching to see if her father has the good sense God gave him." Rosie from her chair said nothing, but she was watching. Ethan picked up the spoon. The morning moved forward the way mornings did when three people who did not know each other were confined to one space by weather and circumstance and necessity. There was a careful politeness to it at first, a set of unspoken negotiations about space and habit and where to look when someone needed a private moment. Abigail managed it the way she managed most things, practically without sentiment, with the kind of brisk competence that came from years of taking care of everything herself, because there had been no one else to do it. But Rosie was not interested in polite distance. Rosie was interested in everything. She asked about every book on the shelf. She asked about the horse outside and wanted to go see it, and Abigail told her not until the storm broke, and she accepted this with the focused disappointment of a child who intends to revisit the topic. She watched Abigail cook with the intensity of a student who is going to be asked to repeat this later. She told long, winding stories about Texas and the ranch, and a dog named Captain who had chased the barn cats and eventually been relocated to sleep inside after a particularly bad thunderstorm, and had never gone back outside after dark since. "He's very brave in the daytime," Rosie said seriously, "just not at night." "That's allowed," Abigail said. "Daddy says so too." Rosie glanced at her father, who was leaning against the wall near his cot, with his eyes open, but distant, listening to his daughter talk, with an expression on his face that was entirely unguarded in a way Abigail suspected he didn't usually allow. "He says bravery isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and doing the thing anyway." Abigail didn't say anything. "Are you scared of things?" Rosie asked her. "Rosie." Ethan said a warning low in it. "It's a fair question," Rosie said. Abigail looked at the girl. She thought about the door last night. She thought about 3 seconds of standing still with a rifle in her hands and every reason in the world not to move. "Yes," she said. "I'm scared of plenty of things." "But you opened the door anyway," Rosie said. Abigail turned back to the stove. "Eat your cornbread." Rosie ate her cornbread. Later, when the girl had fallen into a nap, and the cabin was as quiet as it ever got with a storm pressing on every side, Ethan spoke from across the room. "She's right, you know," he said. "About the door." Abigail kept her eyes on the window. "I heard a child." "Plenty of people would have kept the door shut even then." "I'm not plenty of people." "No," he said. "You're not." He was quiet for a moment. "You've been on your own out here a long time." "Yes, by choice." She looked at him then. He held it, didn't look away, didn't flinch from the directness of what he'd asked. He had the kind of eyes that stayed steady, even when they shouldn't, even when it would have been more comfortable for everyone to let the moment pass. It irritated her, and she wasn't entirely sure why. "That's a personal question, Mr. Calloway." "It is." He didn't apologize for asking it. "Then why'd you ask it?" "Because you took us in," he said. "Because you sat up all night in that chair, I could see the marks of it this morning. Because you did that without knowing us at all. And because I've met a lot of people and you're not—" He stopped himself, reconsidered. "I'm trying to understand you. That's all." "You don't need to understand me," Abigail said. "You need to rest and heal and wait for this storm to break. That's the beginning and end of what's required here." He was quiet again. Then, "The men who are following us. I should have told you more last night." Abigail turned fully toward him. "They want the ranch," he said. "My wife, she died 8 months ago. Left everything to me and Rosie the way it was always meant to be. But her brother's been contesting it. Says she wasn't in her right mind when she signed the final deed over." His jaw tightened. "She was. She was clearer at the end than she'd ever been. But he's got lawyers, and he's got judges in his pocket in 3 counties, and 2 weeks ago, they sent men to the ranch that weren't lawyers." "What kind of men?" "The kind you don't reason with." He looked at her steadily. "I took Rosie and I rode. I was heading for a friend in Billings who has enough legal standing to help. I didn't make it as far as I planned." He nodded slightly toward his leg. "The injury that happened before the storm. Wire trap on the South Trail. Not an accident." The words were flat and certain. Abigail absorbed this. She looked at the sleeping child. She looked back at the man. "And you think they followed you here?" "I don't know. I lost them 2 days back. But men like that are patient." He met her eyes. "I'm telling you this because you deserve to know what you're in the middle of, and because if anyone comes to this door, I need you to let me handle it." She almost laughed. She controlled it, but barely. "Mr. Calloway, this is my door." "I know that. And I've been handling things at this door for a long time without anyone's help." "I know that too." Something moved through his expression, respect she thought, which surprised her because it was the same look she'd seen on very few faces in her life, and never on a man's face directed at her in that particular frank and uncomplicated way. "I just meant that if they come, they're coming for me, not for you. And I won't have you caught in that." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Rest," she said finally. "We'll worry about the door when there's someone at it." He rested. Abigail stood at the window and looked out at the white and dark, and thought about the ways the world had always found to complicate the things she'd tried to keep simple. She'd made this cabin simple. She'd made her life simple. She'd worked and kept to herself, and asked nothing from anyone, and been asked nothing in return, and it had been quiet, and it had been safe, and it had been, if she was honest with herself, exactly the kind of life that a woman builds when she has stopped believing she deserves a different one. She pressed her fingers to the cold glass of the window and watched the storm. 2 people were breathing in her cabin. One of them had called her brave without making it sound like a consolation prize, and it had unsettled her in a way she had not expected and could not quite name, and she was not entirely sure she was going to be able to put it back wherever it had come from. She wasn't. But she didn't know that yet. The storm did not break the next day. Abigail woke before light, which was her habit, and stood at the window and looked at nothing, because there was nothing to see, just white pressing against the glass and wind that had stopped howling and started something worse, something low and constant and certain, the kind of sound that meant the world had decided to stay buried for a while longer. She built up the fire and started coffee and did not think about the man sleeping 8 feet away. She was very deliberate about not thinking about it. He woke up thinking about his horse. "The black," he said before he'd fully opened his eyes. "Did he?" "He's fine. I've got him sheltered." Ethan sat up slowly, testing himself like a man who doesn't trust his own body after it's failed him. "You went out in that to see to my horse." "I went out to see to mine. I checked yours while I was there." She handed him a cup without looking at him. "There's no virtue in it. It's just what you do." He took the cup. "Not everybody does. Then they shouldn't have horses." He almost smiled again. It got a little further than the night before. Rosie woke up announcing that she was hungry, which Abigail had expected, and that she wanted to see the horses, which she had also expected, and that she had decided her full name was actually Rosie Calloway Turner, because she had decided Abigail was her friend, and friends shared names. Abigail told her that wasn't how names worked. Rosie said she thought it should be. Abigail gave her cornbread, and the argument suspended itself, the way arguments with children suspended themselves, not resolved, just deferred. "She does this," Ethan said, quiet, watching his daughter reorganize Abigail's bookshelf into an order that made sense apparently only to Rosie. "She decides she belongs somewhere, and then she just acts like it's already true. Confident child. Terrifying child." But the way he said it had no edge to it at all. Just the worn, patient, bewildered love of a father who has been outmaneuvered by someone 3 feet tall so many times it has ceased to surprise him. She's been like that since she could walk. Her mother used to say she came into the world already convinced she was expected. Abigail kept her eyes on her coffee. "She sounds like she was a smart woman." She was. A pause. "Clara. Her name was Clara." Abigail didn't push. But she didn't change the subject either, and sometimes the right silence was enough. "She got sick 2 years ago," Ethan said. "Slow, then fast. The way those things go." His voice was level in the way that voices got level when a man had told himself a story enough times that it no longer cut as deep on the telling, only on the quiet afterward. "Rosie handled it better than I did. Or she looked like she did. Kids do that. They look fine. And then one night they wake up at 3 in the morning and they're standing in the doorway and you realize they haven't been fine at all. They've just been taking care of you." The cabin was very quiet for a moment. "How old was Rosie when Clara passed?" Abigail asked. 5. Just 5. He looked at his daughter who had finished reorganizing the books and was now apparently having a serious conversation with Abigail's cast-iron skillet. "She doesn't talk about missing her. She just finds women she likes and decides they're part of the family. Happened with our housekeeper. Happened with the postmistress in town. Now apparently—" He stopped himself. "Apparently me?" Abigail said. "I'm sorry if it's—" "Don't apologize for her." Abigail said it more sharply than she intended, and then steadied herself and set down her cup. "Don't apologize for a child who knows how to love people. That's not something to be sorry for." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said, "it's not." Rosie chose that moment to turn from the skillet and announce that the skillet had agreed with her that she should be allowed to see the horses today, and that its name was Gerald. Abigail told her that the skillet's name was absolutely not Gerald, and the horses were still off limits until the snow calmed down. Rosie accepted this with the solemn gravity of someone entering a formal negotiation, and said she would need at least one story about horses in the meantime as compensation. Abigail said she didn't tell stories. Rosie looked at the wall of books and back at Abigail with an expression that made very clear she found this claim implausible. Abigail told her a story about horses. She hadn't intended to. It came out of her the way things did when you'd been alone long enough that the words had been collecting somewhere without anywhere to go. Slow at first, then steadier. A story about a mare she'd trained at 16. A difficult animal that no one else had been able to handle. Not because there was anything wrong with the horse, but because the people trying to handle her kept approaching her like she was a problem to be solved, rather than a creature with her own logic. She talked about learning to think the way the horse thought. About patience that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with understanding. About the morning the mare had finally walked to her without being asked and put her nose against Abigail's shoulder and just stood there. When she stopped talking, Rosie was sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring up at her with her whole face open. "That's the best story I ever heard," Rosie said. "It's not a story, it's just something that happened." "Those are always the best ones." Rosie looked at her father. "Daddy, did you hear that?" "I heard," Ethan said. He was looking at Abigail in a way she couldn't quite classify, which she disliked, because she had a strong preference for being able to classify the ways people looked at her. Pity she knew. Contempt she knew. Polite indifference she knew extremely well. This was none of those things, and it sat uncomfortably in the space between them. "You're good with her," he said. "She's easy to be good with." "Not everybody finds her easy. Then those people aren't paying attention." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know you don't have to answer it." "Then don't ask it." "Do you mind if I ask it anyway?" She looked at him. "You're going to ask it either way." "Probably." He leaned forward, slightly elbows on knees, the posture of a man who asks things directly when he decides to ask them at all. "You said last night that you'd been on your own here a long time. And the way you said it, it wasn't just a fact. It was a decision. I've known a lot of lonely people, and I know the difference between someone who ended up alone and someone who chose it. So I want to know what made you choose it." The cabin felt smaller suddenly. Abigail stood up and went to the window and looked at the white nothing outside, and thought about whether she was going to answer him, and came very close to not doing it. She had a whole architecture built around not doing it. Years of walls and practiced deflections and the particular skill of making people feel answered without having actually said anything real. But Rosie was in the room, and for reasons Abigail could not fully account for, she found it difficult to perform her usual habits in front of this child who had decided without permission to trust her. "A man," she said finally, "a long time ago. She stopped, chose her words the way she chose everything carefully. "He told people a story about me. It wasn't a kind story, and the town believed it because it was easier to believe, and because women like me don't often get the benefit of the doubt." She paused. "After a while, you stop fighting the story. You just get out of its way." The fire crackled. Rosie was very still. "Women like you," Ethan said. She turned. "Excuse me, you said women like you." His voice was even, not argumentative, just precise. "I'm asking what you mean by that." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said flatly, with the practiced certainty of someone who has repeated something so many times, it stopped hurting and started just being fact. "Mr. Calloway, I am a large woman of modest means and no social standing in a county where those things matter considerably. I am not what men pursue and not what women admire. I am what people tolerate when they need something cooked or an animal seen to. I stopped arguing with that a long time ago." She said it the way she always said it. Clean and direct and done. Ethan Calloway said nothing for so long that she began to think she'd silenced him, which was what she'd intended. Then he said, "I think that might be the most dishonest thing you've said since I got here." She stiffened. "I beg your pardon. You told me you don't tell stories. But that—" He shook his head slowly. "That's a story, Miss Turner. Somebody else's story that you've been carrying around so long you've started thinking you wrote it yourself." He held her gaze. "I'm sorry that happened to you, and I think you're wrong about what you are." Abigail opened her mouth. She had a perfectly good response forming. A crisp, definitive response that would end this conversation and return them to appropriate distance. She never got to use it, because that was the moment someone knocked on the door, not the tentative knock of a lost traveler. 3 hard, deliberate strikes. The knock of a person who expects the door to open. Ethan was on his feet before the sound finished, which should not have been physically possible with his leg in that condition, and yet he was upright with a hand on the wall and his eyes fixed on the door with an expression that was entirely different from any she'd seen on him before. The careful, considered man was gone. What was standing in his place was something that had learned at some point to respond to threat instantly. "Rosie," he said low and quiet. "Go to the far corner. Sit down. Don't make a sound." Rosie went without a word, which told Abigail more about what this family had been through than anything Ethan had said. Abigail picked up her rifle. Ethan looked at it, then at her. A question without words. "My door," she said. She went to it and stood to the side the way her father had taught her before he died, so the frame was between her and whatever was outside. "Who's there?" A voice came through the wood, male, unhurried. The kind of unhurried that wasn't relaxed but controlled. "Afternoon, ma'am. Awful sorry to bother you in this weather. Just a couple of riders looking for shelter from the storm. Saw your light." Abigail looked at Ethan. He shook his head once, very small. "I'm afraid I don't have room," she called back. "You'll want to head back to Harlan. It's 7 miles south, easy enough in this." A pause. 7 miles is a long ride in a blizzard, ma'am. We wouldn't take up much space. I run a small operation here. I truly can't accommodate." Her voice didn't shake. She made sure of it. "I'd suggest moving on." Another pause, this one longer. "You wouldn't happen to have seen another rider come through man-dark coat traveling with a little girl, were colleagues of his. He's expected." The word colleagues landed wrong. It was too smooth, too ready. "Haven't seen anyone," Abigail said. "Good luck in the storm, gentlemen." She stood at the door and counted her own heartbeats and did not move until she heard the horses. 2 of them, moving away. Not fast. Deliberately slow, which was its own kind of message. She turned around. Ethan had one hand against the wall and the other pressed flat against his thigh, and he was breathing with the slow control of a man managing something. She couldn't tell if it was pain or the other thing. "Colleagues," she said. "Yes." "You knew they'd come." "I thought they might." "You thought they might." She set the rifle down on the table and looked at him and let the fullness of what she felt reach her face, which she almost never did, because she had built an entire life on not letting things reach her face. "You brought this to my door, to Rosie's door." "I didn't. I lost them. I was sure I'd—" "You lost them, and then you ended up at my door instead." She stopped herself, breathed, looked at him steadily. "How bad is this, Mr. Calloway? I need the real answer. Not the version you tell someone you're trying not to frighten." He held her gaze. "Bad enough that I can't go back to Texas until I reach my friend in Billings. Bad enough that those men aren't going to stop. My brother-in-law has a lot of money, and the men that money buys don't give up because of a blizzard." He paused. "I'm sorry. I genuinely am. If I'd known—" "You would have knocked anyway," Abigail said. "You had Rosie." He didn't deny it. She sat down and pressed her hands flat on her knees and thought about this with the same organized practicality she'd used to think about everything her whole life, because panic was a luxury she'd never been able to afford, and she didn't intend to start now. "They'll come back," she said. "When the storm breaks and they can move easier." "Yes. And your leg." "I can ride." "You absolutely cannot ride." "Miss Turner, I dressed that wound." She looked at him. "I know what's in it. You cannot ride, not for at least 3 more days, maybe 4. She held up a hand before he could speak. "And before you tell me you've ridden worse, I'm sure you have. Men always have. But Rosie is here, and if you push that leg and go down on a trail in a storm, you are not the only one who suffers for it." That reached him. She could see it reach him. He sat back down. Not because she'd told him to, because she was right, and he was a man honest enough to know it. 3 days, he said. Maybe 4. And in the meantime, if they come back. I'll handle my door, Abigail said. I've been handling it longer than you've known I existed. From the corner very quietly, Rosie said, I knew you were brave. Abigail looked at her. The girl was watching her with those enormous eyes, and the expression on her face was not the fearful, wide-eyed look of a child who'd been frightened by strange men at the door, but something older. Something that had already decided how it felt about the woman standing in the middle of the room with a rifle and a level voice, and no intention of moving. Abigail did not know what to do with that look. She had absolutely no idea where to put it. So she went to the stove and started cooking, because that was the thing she knew how to do, when the world tilted sideways and offered her something she hadn't prepared for, and behind her the cabin was quiet, except for the storm and the fire, and the sound of 2 people who had ridden into her life on a collapsing horse. And were she? Was beginning to understand not going to leave it as easily. The 3rd day brought something she hadn't expected. Not danger, not another knock at the door, but Ethan on his feet, limping hard, but refusing the wall, insisting on being useful. He mended the split in her chair that she'd been ignoring for 2 winters. He sharpened her kitchen knives with the focused attention of a man who needed to do something with his hands. Rosie had finally gotten her visit to the horses bundled into everything Abigail owned that was small enough to approximate fitting her, and had come back inside vibrating with joy, and immediately named Ethan's horse something he refused to accept. You cannot name him Biscuit, Ethan said. He looks like a biscuit. He's a working horse. He doesn't look like anything. He looks like a biscuit, Daddy. Abigail, doesn't he look like a biscuit? Abigail, who had very firm opinions about staying out of conversations that were not her business, said, I think that's between you and the horse. Rosie decided the horse's name was Biscuit. But that evening, after Rosie slept and the cabin went quiet, Ethan said something that was not about horses or names or anything that could be deflected. He said, I want you to come to Texas. Abigail looked up from her book. Not permanently, I'm not saying. He stopped, tried again. He was. She realized a man who was very accustomed to knowing what he meant, and considerably less accustomed to struggling to say it. There's going to be a legal proceeding. My friend in Billings can help start it. But it may take months, and my brother-in-law is going to use every tool he has to make me look unstable and unfit. He's already started. He looked at her directly. You're a witness. You found us. You kept us alive. What you say matters. She held his gaze. That's why you want me to come. That's one reason. What's the other reason? He was quiet for a moment. Then steadily, Rosie's going to ask you every day for the rest of this storm. And when the storm breaks, she's going to ask you again. And I reckon you should hear it from me first, so you can think about it without her watching your face while you decide. Abigail closed her book. I'll think about it, she said. She thought about it for exactly as long as it took her to look at the sleeping child across the room. And then she stopped thinking and started being afraid, which was different and more honest, and considerably harder to put away. She told him yes on the 4th morning. She didn't make a production of it. She put a cup of coffee in front of him and said, I'll come to Texas. And then she went back to the stove, and that was the whole conversation. Ethan didn't whoop or reach for her hand or make the kind of noise a lesser man might have made. He just said, thank you quietly. The way you said thank you when you understood the full weight of what someone had just offered you. That was the version she could accept. She filed it away and finished breakfast, and didn't think about it again until 3 days later, when the storm finally broke and the world came back white and hard and blinding, and she stood in the doorway of her cabin for a long time looking at it. She'd lived there 11 years. She had not left the county in 6. Rosie appeared at her elbow. Are you scared? I thought we settled that question already. You said you were scared of plenty of things. You didn't say if this was one of them. Abigail looked down at her. Go get your coat, Rosie. Rosie went and got her coat, but the question stayed. The ride to Billings took 2 days. Ethan's friend, a man named Cole Whitfield, a lawyer with a gray beard and careful eyes, and the kind of stillness that came from spending 20 years in courtrooms, met them at the edge of town and looked Abigail over with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Then he said, "You're the woman who brought him back from that infection." And she said yes, and he nodded once and extended his hand and shook hers, like she was a person whose hand was worth shaking, which she noted and filed away. The meeting in Whitfield's office lasted 3 hours. Abigail sat in the corner and listened, and understood most of it, which surprised Whitfield when he looked at her once or twice to gauge her comprehension, and found her already ahead of his explanation. She had always been able to follow the shape of things. It was one of the skills nobody gave her credit for, because nobody was looking closely enough. The shape of this was not good. Warren Holt. Clara's brother Ethan's brother-in-law had spent 8 months building a legal architecture designed to prove that Clara had been mentally incapacitated when she'd finalized the deed, which would revert half the Calloway holdings to the Holt family trust. He had 3 sworn statements from doctors who had never examined Clara. He had a judge in San Antonio with a known personal debt to the Holt family. And he had, as Whitfield put it, with practiced understatement, considerable patience. "He doesn't actually want the ranch," Whitfield said. Ethan looked up. "What?" "He wants the water rights. The east section of Calloway land sits over the largest underground water source in 3 counties. The ranch is leverage. He bankrupts you fighting the claim you sell the east section to cover the legal costs. He gets what he actually wanted." Whitfield laid the document on the table. "He's been planning this since before Clara died." The room was very quiet. Abigail watched Ethan's face. She watched something move through it that was not anger exactly, though anger was in there, something older than anger, something that happened when you understood that the people who were supposed to be your family had been counting days while someone you loved was still breathing. "He was at the funeral," Ethan said. It came out low. "Yes." "He gave the eulogy." Whitfield didn't say anything. Ethan stood up from the chair and walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room and his hands at his sides, and Abigail watched him breathe through it, the way she'd watched him breathe through fever and pain and a knock on a cabin door, controlled deliberate refusing to let it take him down. After a moment, he turned back around and his face was level again, and he said, "What do we do?" That was the other thing she'd filed away, the way he came back. Every time. The proceedings were set for 3 weeks out in a county courthouse in Austin, where Whitfield had managed to shift jurisdiction away from San Antonio and the compromised judge. They traveled to Ethan's ranch in the meantime, and that was where things changed. The Calloway ranch was enormous. She'd known it intellectually. Rosie had said very big, with the casual authority of a child, describing something she'd always known, but knowing and standing at the gate and looking at the scale of it were different things. Abigail stood there on the wagon seat with her traveling bag in her lap and looked at this man's life and felt the full distance between where he came from and where she came from land on her shoulders all at once. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Pruitt, met them at the door. She was polite, precisely carefully polite in the way that people were when they were managing their reaction to something they hadn't expected. Abigail saw the assessment happen in real time, the quick look that took in her size, her clothes, the absence of anything that marked her as belonging in a house like this, and she saw the conclusion form, and she recognized it the way you recognized a road you'd walked before. "We've prepared a guest room," Mrs. Pruitt said. "Thank you," Abigail said, and picked up her own bag. The first week was manageable. Abigail stayed close to the ranch work. There was always ranch work and helped in the kitchen, where Mrs. Pruitt had initially hovered, and then, after watching Abigail work for 3 days, with the focused efficiency of someone who had been feeding large households since she was a teenager, had quietly stepped back and let her. Rosie was delighted by this development. She sat on the kitchen counter and talked while Abigail cooked, and the two of them had developed a functional routine that required no negotiation, because Rosie adapted to the people she decided to keep with the ease of water, finding a new channel. The neighbors started coming on day 9. Abigail heard the first of them before she saw her. A woman's voice, bright and carrying in the front room where Ethan had been reviewing documents with Whitfield, a voice that had the particular practiced warmth of someone who was very interested in knowing things and very skilled at making that interest feel like affection. Abigail stood in the kitchen doorway and watched through the hall as a slim, well-dressed woman in her 40s handed Ethan a pie and said something that made him smile politely and clearly feel nothing. The woman's name was Dorothea Haynes. She was a widow. She owned the neighboring property to the west and had, according to Mrs. Pruitt's carefully neutral account, been calling with some frequency since Clara passed. She saw Abigail in the hallway, and her smile didn't drop. It shifted, reorganized itself into something still warm, but with a new quality underneath it, the kind of warmth that wants you to know it's noticed you. "And who is this?" Dorothea said. "Abigail Turner," Ethan said. "She helped us during the storm in Montana. She'll be staying for the proceedings." "How generous of you," Dorothea said. To Abigail, with a tone that made generous mean something else entirely. Abigail looked at her. "Kind of you to bring pie," she said, and went back to the kitchen. By the end of the second week, she understood the full shape of what Dorothea Haynes had already begun. It moved through the community the way those things always moved, quietly, politely, in the language of concern. She heard pieces of it third-hand through Mrs. Pruitt's careful silences, and the way the ranch hands looked past her when they thought she wasn't watching, and Whitfield's assistant, a young man named Davies, who was transparently terrible at concealing what he'd overheard. Women like her didn't belong in houses like this. That was the simple version. The detailed version, the version circulating over card tables and church steps and quiet dinners, was that Ethan Calloway was a man in a vulnerable position who had been taken in by a woman who had appeared at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right skills, and was clearly positioning herself for something. She'd heard this story before. Different details, same architecture. What she hadn't expected was the courtroom. The first day of proceedings, Whitfield called her to the stand before noon, and the moment she stood up, she felt the room change. Not dramatically, just a shift in the quality of the attention directed at her, the particular attention that a room gave to something it had already decided about but was willing to watch for confirmation. She'd walked into rooms like this before. You learn to carry yourself straight through them. Warren Holt's lawyer was a man named Garrett Sims. He was young, expensively dressed, and had the kind of confidence that came from never having been significantly wrong about anything in his professional life. He let Whitfield finish his direct examination with a patient, faintly amused expression. Then he stood up. "Miss Turner," he said, "you live alone on a remote property in Montana." "Yes." "You work as a cook and stable hand for the McGrady Ranch." "Yes." "And you've lived in that county for 11 years, is that right?" "About that." "In those 11 years, can you name any civic organizations you've been part of? Any church membership? Any professional standing?" Whitfield said. Objection. Relevance. The judge, a rangy man with a cautious expression, said, "I'll allow it." Abigail looked at Garrett Sims. "No, I've lived quietly." "Quietly," he repeated like the word was interesting. "Are you aware of any, shall we say, reputational matters in your home county? Any accounts from neighbors or community members regarding your character?" She knew what he meant. He'd done his research. She'd expected this, and she'd expected it to land the way it landed in her chest in the particular place where 12 years of having your name in other people's mouths lived. "I'm aware that there are stories," she said. "Stories." He let that sit. "And yet Mr. Calloway trusted you completely, with his daughter, with his life, with his home." He turned slightly, addressing both her and the room. "Can you tell us, Miss Turner, how that trust was established? In what manner did you present yourself to a vulnerable widower in a remote location with no witnesses?" The room made a sound that wasn't quite noise, an intake, a settling. Ethan said sharply from the table, "That's enough." Whitfield's hand came down on his arm. Abigail looked at Garrett Sims, and then she looked at the room. All of it. The well-dressed women in the gallery who'd never spoken to her, the men who'd looked through her, the judge with his careful expression. Warren Holt, seated at the far table with his hands folded and his face arranged in a portrait of patient concern. And then something happened that she had not planned and could not have explained. She stopped being afraid, not because the fear wasn't there. It was there. It was always there. But it had a floor to it, and she had found the floor and was standing on it, and it was solid, and it was hers. And she had built it out of 11 years of surviving things that should have bent her flat and hadn't. And she was done letting other people's comfort be more important than her own truth. "I'd like to answer that," she said, "to the judge." He looked at her. "Miss Turner, you are under no obligation." "I know I'm not. I'd like to anyway." He gestured for her to proceed. She turned back to face the room, and not just Garrett Sims, because the room was who she was really talking to. She could feel Ethan watching her. She didn't look at him. "I am a large woman," she said. "I think that's what Mr. Sims is pointing at, without quite having the honesty to say it directly. I am a large woman with no money and no social standing, and a reputation that somebody else wrote for me when I was 26 years old and grieving and not fast enough to stop it. I have lived with that reputation for 12 years in a county where it preceded me into every room. So yes, I know what it looks like. I know exactly what story people are telling when they look at me and look at Ethan Calloway and try to find the thing that doesn't belong." She stopped. She let it breathe. "A man came to my door in a blizzard with an infected leg and a terrified 6-year-old child who was standing in the snow trying to hold him up. And I opened the door. I opened it because of the child, because I am not built in such a way that I can hear a child afraid and do nothing. And if that makes me a fool, then I am a fool. But I did not go through his coat for his money while he was unconscious. I did not position myself for anything. I made soup and sat up all night in a chair watching a fever I was praying would break." She looked at Warren Holt, then directly steadily. "I know what it looks like when someone is loved. I grew up without a lot of it, so I learned to recognize it fast, and that man, that family is not something anyone needs to be protected from. The question this court ought to be asking is not what I wanted from Ethan Calloway. It's what Warren Holt wants. And I think if you look at the water rights on the east section, you will find your answer considerably faster than you've been looking for it." The courtroom had gone so quiet, she could hear the person 3 rows back shift in their seat. Garrett Sims said, "Your Honor, I would ask that the witness be instructed." "Sit down, Mr. Sims," the judge said. He was looking at Abigail with an expression she couldn't read for a full second, and then she read it, and it was something she had almost never seen directed at her in a room full of people. It was attention, real attention. The kind that meant he was hearing her and filing it and reconsidering things. He turned to Warren Holt's table. "Mr. Sims, the witness, has raised a material point regarding the water rights on the eastern parcel. I'm going to want documentation regarding the acquisition history of that section before we continue." He looked at the room. "We'll recess until 2 o'clock. The gavel came down. Ethan was beside her before she'd fully stepped down from the stand. He didn't say anything for a moment, and she was grateful for that, because she needed a moment, and she'd learned he understood the shape of moments. Then he said very quietly, close enough that only she could hear, "That was the bravest thing I have ever seen a person do." She looked at him. Her hands, she realized, were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat against her sides. "I just told the truth, in a room full of people who didn't want to hear it." He held her gaze. "Don't do that, Abigail. Don't make it smaller than it was." She didn't have an answer for that. She looked away first, which she almost never did, and she walked toward the exit and the cool air beyond it. And she didn't stop until she was on the courthouse steps with the Texas sun on her face, and she stood there and let herself shake for exactly as long as she needed to. Then she stopped. From behind her the door opened and she heard Rosie's small boots on the stone steps, and then a small hand found hers, just slipped right into it. No announcement, no question asked, and held on. Abigail looked down at her. "You were really loud," Rosie said. "In a good way. Gerald thought so too." Abigail's throat did something she wasn't prepared for. She looked back at the sky and breathed through it. "Gerald is a skillet, Rosie. He wasn't there. I told him about it this morning. He agreed in advance." Abigail held the small hand and did not say anything, and the sun stayed where it was, and the courthouse stood behind them full of everything that had just happened. And she was still afraid. She was still shaking. She was still every single thing the room had tried to make her feel small for being. But she was on her feet, and she had not moved. The recess lasted 40 minutes. It felt like 3 hours. Whitfield found her on the steps with Rosie, and looked at her with an expression that was entirely different from the careful, measured look he'd had in his office in Billings. Something in it had loosened. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've been doing this for 22 years, and I have never had a witness redirect the court's attention to the material evidence on their own initiative." He paused. "It was either the most reckless thing I've seen, or the smartest." "Which one?" Abigail said. "I'll tell you when the verdict comes in." But the corner of his mouth moved. "Get some water. We go back in at 2. At 2 o'clock, Warren Holt's lawyer spent 35 minutes trying to reframe the water rights question as irrelevant to the matter of Clara's mental capacity. The judge listened with the patience of a man who had already made up his mind about the shape of the argument and was waiting for it to finish. When Sims sat down, the judge asked Whitfield 3 specific questions about the deed's timeline. Whitfield answered all 3. The judge made notes. He called a second recess and did not come back for an hour. When he came back, he ruled in Ethan's favor on the preliminary motion. Not the whole case, just the motion. The full proceeding would continue, but the shift was tectonic. Whitfield explained it that way later, quietly in the hallway, while Rosie sat on a bench eating a biscuit she'd produced from somewhere, because the preliminary ruling effectively told Warren Holt that his legal architecture had a crack in it, and cracks in expensive structures had a way of becoming something worse. Across the hallway, Abigail watched Warren Holt confer with his lawyer in rapid, low voices. She had never seen him up close before today. He was a trim man, neat with Clara's coloring, and none of Clara's she assumed warmth. He looked like a man who had planned for many things, and was now calculating rapidly which of his contingencies still held. As if he felt her looking, he turned his head and met her eyes. He held them for a long moment. Then he looked away first. She hadn't expected that. She stored it carefully. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the ride out. Rosie fell asleep against Abigail's arm before they'd cleared the town limits, which happened with the sudden completeness that only children could manage one moment awake and talking about Gerald, and the next entirely absent, her full weight pressing warm and trusting into Abigail's side. Abigail sat very still so as not to disturb her. Ethan across from them watched. "You're good at that," he said. Same thing he'd said in the cabin. Different weight behind it now. "She's tired." Abigail kept her voice low. "That's not what I mean." He looked at his daughter's sleeping face and then back at her. "I want to say something, and I want to say it right, so I'm going to take a moment." "Take whatever you need." He took a breath. "What you did in that courtroom today that wasn't for me. I know that. It was for Rosie, and for the truth, and maybe for yourself, and I'm not going to pretend it was a favor to me specifically." He paused. "But it was the first time in 8 months that I felt like someone was standing with me. Not behind me. Not in front of me running the show. With me." He looked at her. "I haven't had that in a long time." Abigail looked down at Rosie's sleeping face and said nothing. "I'm not asking you for anything tonight," Ethan said. "I just wanted you to know that." She nodded once and looked out at the passing dark and held the sleeping child carefully and did not trust herself to speak, which was new because she had always trusted herself to speak or to choose silence deliberately, and this was neither. This was something quieter and more frightening than both. The next 3 weeks moved fast. The full proceedings took 6 days, spread over 3 weeks, and in those 3 weeks, several things happened that reshaped the geography of Abigail's life in ways she had not anticipated and could not have mapped in advance. The first was Warren Holt's final move. He played it on the 4th day of proceedings, and she had to admit privately, with the honest part of her mind, that evaluated things clearly, regardless of personal stakes, that it was well constructed. He produced a letter. A letter he claimed written by Clara in the last month of her life, addressed to her brother, describing her fear that Ethan was managing her into certain decisions regarding the property. The letter was dated 6 weeks before Clara's death. It was written in Clara's handwriting. Whitfield requested an immediate recess. In the hallway, Ethan's face was stone. "It's false," he said. The words came out flat and absolute. "Clara never feared me. She would never—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "She loved that ranch. She wanted Rosie to have it. She told me that every day at the end." "I believe you," Whitfield said. "But we need more than belief." Abigail said, "Ask Mrs. Pruitt." Both men looked at her. "Your housekeeper," she said. "She was with Clara at the end, wasn't she?" "Daily?" Ethan said slowly. "Yes." "Then she knows what Clara's state was in those last weeks. She knows her handwriting. She knows whether that letter matches the woman she was taking care of." Abigail looked at Whitfield. "Put her on the stand." Whitfield thought for exactly 4 seconds. Then he turned and found Davies and sent him running. Mrs. Pruitt took the stand the following morning, and she did not look like a woman who had ever been on a witness stand, or intended to be again. She was rigid with discomfort. But when Whitfield asked her about Clara Calloway's state of mind in the final weeks of her life, something shifted in her, the particular shift that happens when a private person is asked directly about something they loved, and their discomfort loses to their honesty. "She was the clearest I'd ever seen her," Mrs. Pruitt said. Her voice was tight but steady. "People think dying makes a person confused. Sometimes it does the opposite. She knew exactly what she wanted, and she said it plainly, and she said it every day." She paused. "She wanted Rosie to have her home. She wanted Ethan to know he'd been a good husband. She said those 2 things more than anything." "And the letter?" Whitfield held it up. Mrs. Pruitt looked at it for a long time. Clara's handwriting sloped left. Since she was a girl, she couldn't help it. Her mother used to try to correct it. She looked at the letter. "That slopes right." The courtroom went very still. Garrett Sims stood up fast. "Your Honor." "Sit down, Mr. Sims," the judge said, for the second time. Warren Holt at his table did not move, but Abigail watched his hands. His fingers pressed flat against the table and then curled slowly, and that was the only thing that moved on him. And she thought that was the moment, not the judge's words, not Whitfield's argument, but that small, involuntary curl of his fingers. That was the moment Warren Holt understood he had lost. The ruling came 2 days later. Full ruling. Ethan retained the ranch the deed stood, and the judge referred the forged letter to additional investigation, with language that made Whitfield lean back in his chair and exhale for what felt like the first time in 3 weeks. Ethan sat at the table and didn't move for a long moment. Rosie climbed into his lap, which she was probably too old to do and did anyway, and pressed her face against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her and closed his eyes. And Abigail looked away, because that was a private thing, and she knew how to recognize private things and respect them. That evening on the porch of the ranch house, Ethan found her. She'd been sitting out there long enough that the stars had shifted. She heard him come, still a slight drag, to the step on his right side, the leg not fully itself, maybe never quite fully itself again, and he sat down in the other chair without asking, which she'd come to understand was just how he was. He didn't ask permission for the things he had a right to. "I want you to stay," he said. She'd known it was coming. She'd been sitting with the shape of it for 2 weeks. "Ethan, not as a guest, not because of the proceedings." He turned to look at her. "I want you to stay because this ranch is better with you in it, and I am better with you in it, and Rosie—" He stopped. "Rosie is better in ways I don't have the right words for." Abigail looked at her hands. "You're grateful." "Don't do that. It's a reasonable—" "Abigail." His voice was very level. "I know the difference between gratitude and want. I've been alive 41 years and I know my own mind. Don't tell me what I'm feeling." She stood up, not to leave, just because she couldn't hold this sitting still. She went to the porch railing and put her hands on it and looked at the dark yard and the distant shape of the barn, and tried to find the right words for the thing she needed to say. "I have spent 12 years," she said, "being very careful not to want things I couldn't have. Not because I'm weak, because I learned the hard way that wanting the wrong things in the wrong direction costs you more than just the wanting." She paused. You are not a thing I know how to want carefully, Ethan. You're too much. This is too much, and I am very aware of what I look like standing in the middle of it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up and came to the railing and stood beside her close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool night air, and he said, "I don't care what it looks like." "You don't have to care. Other people will do it for you. Let them." She turned and looked at him, and he was looking back at her with that steadiness she'd catalogued since the first morning, that quality of a man who had decided something and was not going to be argued out of it by anything less than her actual truth. "You say that now," she said. "I'll say it next year." He held her gaze. "I'll say it in whatever room I need to say it in." Her chest hurt. She pressed her hand against the railing harder. "I'm not Clara." The words came out before she'd fully decided to say them, and she heard them land between them, and couldn't take them back, and wasn't sure she would have. He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "You're not, and I'm not asking you to be." He paused. "Clara was my wife, and I loved her, and she's gone, and you are something entirely different. Something I didn't know to look for." His voice was careful in the way of a man who usually chose silence over imprecision, and was choosing precision now because it mattered. "I'm not replacing her. I'm telling you that there's room. That's all." She looked at him, and looked at him, and looked at him. And then she heard the screen door open behind them, and small feet on the porch boards, and Rosie appeared in her nightgown with her hair tangled and her eyes still half full of sleep, and she looked between them with the uncanny perception of a child who had been listening from inside for a while. "Abigail," Rosie said, "you should be asleep. I know." She walked to Abigail without preamble and stood directly in front of her and looked up with those enormous dark eyes that had stared at her through a blizzard on the first night and not looked away since. "You're the first person who made this house feel safe again. Since Mama." She said it plainly, the way she said everything true, without decoration, without strategy, just the fact of it, laid down between them like something solid. "I just wanted you to know that." Abigail couldn't speak for a moment. Rosie, apparently satisfied, turned around and went back inside, and the screen door swung shut behind her. The night was very quiet. Abigail pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for 1 second. Just one. Then she lowered it and breathed and looked at the dark yard and the stars and the shape of the barn and all the things that made up this life that was not hers and that she had been standing carefully at the edge of. "She means it," Ethan said quietly. "I know she does." Her voice was not entirely steady. She didn't try to make it so. "That's the problem." "Why is it a problem?" She looked at him. "Because I believe her." She stopped, swallowed. "I never believe people. I haven't believed a person in 12 years. And I believe that child completely." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Maybe that means something." "It means something," she said. "I haven't decided yet what I'm going to do about it." "Take your time." "I don't need time." She looked at him directly. "I need you to understand what you're actually asking. Not the legal part. Not the practical part. You're asking a woman who built her whole life around not needing anyone to stop building in that direction. That is a significant request." "I know it is." "And you're asking it anyway." "Yes." She was quiet for a long time. Ethan stayed where he was and did not rush her and did not fill the silence. And she was grateful for that, in a way she couldn't have articulated that he understood the weight of a real silence and didn't try to fix it. Finally, she said, "I'll need my own space, my own work. I'm not going to be a decoration or a charity case, and I'm not going to be managed." He said, "I wouldn't know how to manage you if I tried." That's the right answer. I've learned a few things. She almost smiled. It surprised her. The stable needs reorganizing. I noticed it the first week. The feed rotation is inefficient, and whoever set up the stall assignments didn't account for the temperament differences between the quarter horses and the bee Abigail. What? Is that a yes? She looked at him. She thought about a door in a blizzard and 3 seconds of standing still, and the choice she'd made, that she hadn't understood yet, was a choice for something rather than just a choice to help. She thought about what it cost, and what it was worth, and whether those two things balanced, and whether for once in her life she was willing to let the worth be bigger than the cost. It's a yes, she said, but I reorganized the stable. The stable is yours, he said. She nodded once and looked back at the yard, and he stayed beside her at the railing, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and the night held them both. And it was the first time in 11 years that a silence had felt like company, rather than just the absence of noise. Inside the house, behind the screen door, a small pair of feet padded back to bed. Rosie Calloway pulled her quilt up and pressed her face into the lavender-scented pillow, and smiled at the ceiling with the complete satisfaction of a 6-year-old who had understood the situation entirely and handled it appropriately. She thought Gerald the Skillet would be very pleased. The weeks that followed moved differently than anything Abigail had known. She reorganized the stable on the 3rd day, which caused the head ranch hand, a weathered man named Bill Cruz, who had worked the Calloway land for 14 years and had opinions about everything, to stand in the doorway and watch her work with a look that started skeptical and progressed over the course of 2 hours into something else. "You done this before," he said. "Not a question. Most of my life. That rotation you set up with the quarter horses." He nodded slowly. "That'll cut the feed waste by 1/3. "About that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up a brush and started working on the roan at the far end without another word, which she came to understand was Bill Cruz's version of a significant declaration. The other ranch hands followed his lead. Not immediately, not all of them at once, but one by one, in the practical way of people who respected competence when it proved itself without asking for their approval. First, they adjusted. Dorothea Haynes came to call one more time. She stood in the front room and looked at Abigail, moving through the house with the ease of someone who knew where everything was and how everything worked, and her face went through a series of careful expressions that finally settled on something Abigail recognized as the moment a person decides to stop. She never came back after that. The community took longer. Communities always did. But the trial had given them something to recalibrate around, something that the story of Abigail Turner as an opportunist couldn't quite accommodate. The image of her on that witness stand, redirecting the court's attention to evidence that had nothing to do with her own position and everything to do with the truth. Stories were powerful, but so were facts, and the fact of what she'd done in that courtroom circulated alongside the other story, and slowly, unevenly began to outweigh it. And Ethan made sure of that. The first time someone made a remark at the general store, she heard it from Davies, who was still transparently bad at keeping things to himself. Ethan had turned to the man making it and said very quietly, "You want to say that again? I'd like to hear it clearly." The man hadn't said it again. The second time at a neighbor's dinner that she hadn't attended, but that Ethan had implied something about the impropriety of the arrangement, and Ethan had put down his fork and looked at the host and said, "I'll leave right now if this is the conversation we're having." They'd changed the conversation. The third time he brought her with him. "You don't have to do that," she told him. "I know I don't." He held the door for her. "I want to." She walked through the door. She was not comfortable. She was not at ease. She was a woman who had spent 11 years on the outside of rooms like this, and the inside felt different than she'd imagined, which was both better and worse in ways she was still learning to navigate. But she was there, and he was beside her. And when someone's gaze lingered too long on her, in the wrong way, she met it until it moved, which it always eventually did, and she took that small, repeated victory and built something out of it. Something that felt for the first time in a very long time like a life she had chosen. The proposal was not what she expected. She'd thought on the rare occasions she'd let herself think about it at all, that it would be a careful thing. Measured. Something that matched the way Ethan handled most consequential decisions, which was deliberately and with full awareness of the weight involved. She'd thought he might choose an evening, or a significant date, or a moment that had been set up in advance. Instead, he asked her in the stable. She was 3 weeks into a new feed rotation that had already cut waste by more than she'd projected, and she was standing with her back to him, checking the roan's left foreleg, which had been favoring slightly, and he was behind her. And she heard him take a breath that sounded like a man who had been holding a thing a long time and had decided today was the day, regardless of the circumstances. "Marry me," he said. She didn't turn around. Is that a question or an order? It's a question, with some urgency behind it. She stood up and faced him. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her on the courthouse steps on the porch in the dark on every occasion. When the thing between them had come close enough to name that steadiness, that had nothing performative in it. That was just him. Just the way he was built, the way some men were built level all the way down. "Ethan, I've been thinking about it for 3 months. I've thought about every reason it might be complicated, and I've thought about every reason I don't care about any of those reasons." He paused. "I love you. I love who you are in this house, and who you are with Rosie, and who you are when you think nobody's watching, and who you were on that witness stand. I love all of it. I want all of it permanently. So." He held her gaze. "Will you?" The roan shifted behind her, and she put a hand back automatically to steady it, and kept looking at Ethan, and thought about 11 years of building walls, and how she'd been so proud of those walls, how solid they were, how reliable, how much work she'd put into them, and how completely this man and his daughter had walked straight through them without ever once asking permission. "You're going to be very difficult to be married to," she said. "Probably," he agreed. "You're not going to be easy either." "No, we'll manage." She looked at him for one more long moment. Then she said, "Yes," in the same way she'd said it the first time. Clean direct, no ceremony around it, and turned back to the roan because the leg wasn't going to check itself. And behind her she heard him exhale slow and deep, the sound of a man whose chest has been tight for a long time, finally remembering how to be open. Rosie, when they told her, screamed, not in distress. In the pure, undiluted joy of a 7-year-old who had seen this coming for considerably longer than either adult had, and had been waiting with the specific impatience of someone who already knew the answer and couldn't understand why everyone else was taking so long to catch up. She threw herself at Abigail with the full weight of her body, and Abigail caught her. She always caught her and held her up, while Rosie announced into her shoulder that she had told Gerald this would happen, and Gerald had agreed, and she wanted to be involved in every single decision. "You're not picking the flowers," Abigail said. "I'm picking the flowers," Rosie said. She picked the flowers. The wedding was small. They both wanted small, not from shame, not from hiding, but because neither of them was a person who needed an audience for the things that mattered most. The people who came were the people who had earned the right to be there. Whitfield, who cried with the dignified efficiency of a man who considered crying a waste of time but couldn't quite manage to stop. Bill Cruz, who wore a suit that had clearly been purchased for the occasion and stood at the back with his arms crossed, and his expression doing battle between gruff and moved. Mrs. Pruitt, who had progressed from polite distance to something genuine over the months in ways that neither of them had discussed directly, but both had noticed. And 3 neighbors who had come around slowly and honestly, and were there not because they'd been invited out of obligation, but because they wanted to be. Rosie stood beside Abigail and held her flowers with the seriousness of someone performing a sacred duty. The minister was brief. Ethan said his words looking at her the whole time, which she'd expected. She said hers looking back, which she'd had to practice because her instinct was still to look away when something felt too big, too direct, too much like being fully seen. But she'd been working on that. She was still working on it. She suspected she always would be, and that this was not a flaw, but simply the truth of who she was, and she'd stopped needing to apologize for it. When it was done, Rosie grabbed her hand on one side, and Ethan's on the other, and held them both at the same time, and that was the moment that broke her open quietly, privately, in the place behind her face where things that really mattered lived. She held them back, both of them, hard. The months that followed were not easy in the way that stories sometimes suggested the after of a wedding, the golden, untroubled stretch. Life didn't work that way, and she'd never expected it to. Warren Holt resurfaced in the spring, not legally, but socially, spreading revised versions of his narrative to anyone who'd still listen, and there were some who would. The community's opinion of Abigail remained divided in the way of things that had been talked about too long, in too many directions, to ever fully resolve in one. Ethan handled it the same way every time. He said what he said, and he stood where he stood, and he did not negotiate the terms of his wife's worth with anyone. And after a while, people understood that there was no version of the conversation where he was going to agree with them, and most of them stopped trying. She handled it her own way, which was to be so consistently, unmistakably capable that the narrative had nowhere to attach. You couldn't call a woman incompetent when she'd rebuilt a feed rotation that saved the ranch $400 in the first season. You couldn't call her an outsider when the ranch hands came to her first with problems before they went anywhere else. You couldn't say she didn't belong when Rosie walked beside her to town with her hand tucked into Abigail's arm and her chin up and the particular pride of a child who has decided who her people are. Bill Cruz said something to her in the stable in July that she kept. He said, "First week you were here, I thought you'd be gone in a month." He didn't look up from what he was doing. "Thought you were one of those people who shows up big and leaves quiet." "What do you think now?" she said. He grunted. "I think this place runs better than it's run in 15 years. He paused. "That's what I think." She accepted that. From Bill Cruz, it was a significant declaration. Then came September, and the thing that changed everything again. She knew before she told anyone. She'd known for 2 weeks, carrying it in the particular private way she'd carried most things her whole life. Inward, careful, held close until she understood what it meant and what to do with it. She sat with it and thought about 38 years old, and about what she'd believed for most of those years, about what her life would contain and what it wouldn't, about the specific category of want that she'd locked away so completely, she'd convinced herself it was gone. She told Ethan on a Tuesday morning with no preamble. She said, "I'm going to have a baby," and watched his face. He went very still. The kind of still that wasn't shock, but something deeper. The stillness of a man receiving something he'd been afraid to hope for, and hadn't known he was hoping for until it arrived. "Are you—" He stopped. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." "Are you—" He tried again. "What do you—" "Ethan." She looked at him. "I'm happy, in case that's what you're trying to ask." He crossed the room and put his arms around her, and held on, and she let him, and she pressed her face briefly against his shoulder, and breathed in, and was for one unguarded moment just a woman being held by the person who loved her, with no wall, and no distance, and no management of what it looked like. And it was terrifying, and it was necessary, and she stayed in it until it settled. "Rosie is going to be impossible about this," she said into his shoulder. "Completely impossible," he agreed. Rosie was in fact impossible about it. She announced at breakfast that she already had a name selected, and presented 3 options with associated reasoning, and told Abigail that she'd been thinking about it since February, because she'd had a feeling, and her feelings were usually right. Abigail told her the feeling had only been correct since July. Rosie said that was fine, February was just early. The baby came in the spring, a boy. He had Ethan's dark eyes and Abigail's stubbornness, and Rosie's name choice. She'd won that negotiation, as she won most of them, through sheer sustained persistence. His name was James. He was small and loud, and entirely certain of himself, from the first moment which told Abigail everything she needed to know about who he was going to be. She was 40 years old, holding her son in a house that had not been hers a year and a half ago, and she thought, this is what the door was for. Rosie sat beside her and looked at her brother with an expression of complete ownership. "He's going to need someone to tell him how things work," she said. "He has you for that." "And you." "And me." Rosie looked up at her. She was 8 now, nearly 9, and something in her face had begun to have the shape of the woman she was going to be. Still those enormous eyes, still that frankness that cut straight to the point of things, but deeper now, steadier with a quality of knowing that came from a child who had been through genuine difficulty and come out of it with her capacity for trust intact. That last part was the remarkable thing, that she'd kept it. "Abigail," Rosie said. I don't remember being scared that night. In the storm." She paused. "I remember being scared for Daddy. But when you opened the door, I wasn't scared anymore." She looked down at James. "I just knew." Abigail looked at the top of her head for a moment. "Knew what?" "That you were going to take care of us." She didn't say anything for a while. The house was quiet around them, Ethan somewhere down the hall, the ranch going about its business outside the ordinary sounds of a life in motion. "I wasn't sure I was going to open the door," she said finally. She'd never told anyone that. Not the full version. Rosie looked up. "But you did." "I did. Because of me. Because of you." Abigail shifted James slightly against her chest. "I heard you, and something in me just moved. Before I'd decided anything, I was already moving." She paused. "That's never happened to me before. Where my body knew something before my mind caught up." Rosie considered this with the gravity she applied to significant information. Then she said, "Gerald thinks that's love." Abigail looked at her. "Rosie, Gerald is a skillet. A very wise skillet." She stood up and kissed James on the forehead with proprietary tenderness, and went toward the door, and then stopped. "Abigail." "What?" "I'm glad you moved." She said it simply, and went. The autumn of that year, Abigail went back to Montana. She hadn't planned it as a significant trip. Ethan had business near Billings, and she had said without overthinking it that she wanted to go to the cabin while they were up north. He hadn't asked why. He'd said all right and arranged it. She went alone. Just one morning, just a few hours while Ethan kept the children in Billings with the faithful and much-abused Davies. The cabin was empty. The McGrady family had sold the property the previous winter, and it sat unoccupied now, still standing, still solid in the way of things built to survive hard weather. She unlocked it with the key she'd kept out of habit, and stepped inside, and stood in the doorway. It was the same. Smaller than she remembered, which was always how it went. The cot where Ethan had lain with a fever that could have gone either way. The chair where she'd sat all night watching it. The shelf of books. The stove. The window where she'd pressed her fingers to the cold glass and told herself that nothing was going to change. She walked to the window and stood where she'd stood that night. She thought about the woman who had stood here. 38 years old, and so carefully, completely certain that the shape of her life had finished forming, that what she had was what she would have, that the walls she'd built were permanent. She thought about how sure that woman had been, how much work she'd put into being sure, how the certainty had felt like protection and had actually been just another word for stopped. She thought about 3 seconds at a door. She thought about what it cost and what it was worth, and how she'd spent so many years making sure the cost never exceeded what she had, which meant she'd spent so many years never reaching for anything that could surprise her. And then a storm had come, and a child had spoken, and she had moved before she'd decided to. And everything that had come from that single unguarded moment, the fever, the fear, the courtroom, the porch in the dark, the wedding, Rosie's hand in hers, James, all of it had come from 3 seconds of not being careful enough. She stood in the doorway of the empty cabin and understood something she hadn't had words for until now. Safety was not the same as living. She had confused them for 11 years. She had built a life that couldn't hurt her and called it enough, and it had been honest, and it had been hers, and it had also been the loneliest thing she'd ever done. And she had been so committed to it that she'd almost missed the door. She'd almost stood there with her rifle and her reasons and let the storm take them. She pressed her hand against the doorframe. The wood was cold, solid. She thought I almost didn't. And then she thought, but I did. She walked back out into the October air and pulled the door shut behind her, and stood on the porch where the black horse had collapsed and looked at the mountains and the sky, and breathed in until her lungs were full and held it. Somewhere in Billings, Ethan was managing James's opinions about lunch, which were strong, while Rosie supervised with the calm authority of someone who had been right about everything so far and saw no reason to stop. Somewhere there was a ranch with a stable organized exactly the way she needed it, and a crew of men who brought their problems to her first, and a community that had not fully decided about her, and probably never would, and that was all right. That was just how people were, and she had stopped needing everyone to have decided before she could feel at home. She was at home. That was the thing. She was at home in the way that had nothing to do with a building or a county or a community's opinion. She was at home in the way that meant she had stopped running from herself, stopped managing herself, stopped making herself small enough to fit in the space that fear had allocated. She had opened a door in a blizzard, and on the other side of it had been everything she'd stopped believing she deserved. Not because she'd become easier to love, not because the world had gotten kinder, not because she'd changed herself into something more acceptable, but because she had done once the thing that fear had spent 11 years telling her not to do. She had reached out her hand in the dark and let it find something real. She stepped off the porch and walked toward the horse and rode back toward the road. Behind her the cabin stood empty and solid and full of everything that had happened in it. And she did not look back because there was no version of her life now that required her to live there anymore. The bravest thing a person can do is not the grand gesture. It is not the speech in the courtroom, or the night in the chair, or the yes said plainly in the stable. Those things matter. Those things are real. But the bravest thing, the one that makes all the others possible, is the moment before the decision, when everything you've built says, stay closed, and something deeper and older and more honest says, open the door, and you listen to the thing that is older and you move. Abigail Turner had moved, and she never for a single day of the life that followed stopped being glad that she had.